The Kefari had watched the stars for 12 million cycles. And in all that time, they had never been wrong about the fate of lesser species. They called themselves the Observers, ancient beings of light and thought who had seeded intelligent life across 10,000 worlds. And they kept perfect records of every experiment they had ever conducted. The Veluxi had lasted 19 days before. The cold claimed them. The Thorani had survived 42 days before they turned on each other in desperate hunger. The proud Makali had endured 60 days before disease swept through their camps and left nothing but bones. Now the Observers turned their attention to a new species, creatures they had plucked from a dying world called Earth in its final century. They called these creatures Terrans, and they deposited exactly 10,000 of them onto the hostile surface of Varath 9 without warning or explanation. The humans awoke in red dust under an alien sky. And for a long moment, there was only silence and confusion. Commander Yellen Vasquez opened her eyes and tasted copper on her tongue. The air was thin and harsh, and every breath burned in her chest like fire. She pushed herself up from the ground and looked around at the thousands of bodies scattered across the barren plain, some already stirring and others still lost in whatever darkness the Observers had placed them in. Then the voice came. It did not come from the sky or from any visible source, but rather from inside every mind at once, cold and ancient and utterly without mercy. "You have been chosen for the great trial," the voice announced. "And your task is simple. Survive without aid. Prove your worth among the stars, or be forgotten like all the others who came before you." The voice faded, and Yellen was left standing in the red dust, with 10,000 frightened souls and absolutely nothing else. No shelters protected them from the harsh wind that swept across the plains. No tools waited for them to begin building. No food or water had been provided. No guidance came from the empty sky high above the planet. In an orbital station that had existed since before humanity's ancestors had crawled from the oceans, Observer Primary Zethel activated its recording systems and began to document what it expected to be another brief and tragic experiment. Subject species: Terran. Zethel recorded in its data stream. An initial population stands at 10,000 individuals with mixed age and health profiles. The ancient being consulted its mathematical models, the same models that had accurately predicted the downfall of every species for 12 million cycles. Projected survival duration: 30 standard days, Zethel noted with clinical detachment. And primary causes of extinction will likely include exposure, dehydration, and internal conflict. The Observer settled in to watch, expecting nothing more than another sad chapter in the long history of failed experiments down on the surface. Chaos reigned as the humans struggled to understand what had happened to them. Some wept and called out for family members who might be scattered among the moss. Thousands of bodies, some raged at the sky and cursed whatever beings had done this terrible thing to them. Some simply sat in the dust and stared at nothing, their minds unable to accept the reality of their situation. But Commander Yellen Vasquez had not survived 30 years of military service by surrendering to despair. She climbed onto a rocky outcrop and raised her voice above the wind and the crying and the shouting. "Listen to me," she called out, and something in her tone cut through the panic like a blade. "All of you, listen to me right now." Heads turned toward her, thousands of faces marked by fear and confusion and the desperate hope that someone might know what to do. "I do not know where we are," Yellen admitted, "and I do not know who took us or why they expect us to die here." She paused and looked across the sea of humanity spread out before her. "But I know one thing with absolute certainty," she continued, her voice growing stronger with every word, "and that is this: they want us to fail. They want us to turn on each other and die in this red dust. And I refuse to give them that satisfaction." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Yellen could see spines straightening and shoulders squaring as her words found their mark. "We are human beings," she declared, "and our ancestors survived ice ages and plagues and wars and every catastrophe that nature or fate could throw at them. So we will survive this too." The twin suns of Vareth 9 began to sink toward the horizon, and Yellen knew they had only hours before the temperature dropped and the real danger began. "Everyone with military or survival training, come to me now," she ordered, "and everyone else, start gathering into groups of 50 and stay together no matter what happens." To her amazement and relief, the crowd began to organize itself almost immediately. Former soldiers pushed their way toward her position while others counted off and formed into clusters. A doctor named Kofi Mensa appeared at her side, his dark eyes sharp and focused despite the terror of their situation. "We need water first," he said without preamble, "because humans can survive weeks without food, but only days without water. And this air is dry enough to kill us through dehydration alone." An engineer named Mei Chun joined them next, her gaze already scanning the terrain with professional assessment. The rock formations to the east might indicate underground water sources, she observed. "And if we can find caves, we will have shelter from the wind and whatever temperature extremes this world throws at us." More people gathered around them, each one bringing skills and knowledge that might mean the difference between life and death. Geologists who could read the land and predict where resources might hide, a botanist who could identify plants that might be safe to eat, a former construction worker who knew how to build structures from nothing but raw materials, and determination. As night fell over Vareth 9 and the cold began to bite at exposed skin, the humans did not scatter in panic or turn on each other in fear. Instead, they huddled together for warmth and shared what little body heat they had while scouts went out to search for shelter and water in the orbital station above. Observer Primary Zethel noted this behavior with mild surprise. Anomalous coordination observed in initial hours, the ancient being recorded, but such cooperation typically degrades rapidly under survival pressure, and the mathematical models remain confident in the projected 30-day extinction timeline. The observer had no way of knowing how wrong those models would prove to be down on the surface. Commander Yellen Vasquez stood watch through the long cold night while her people slept in tight clusters against the freezing wind. She looked up at the alien stars and made a silent promise to whatever beings had condemned them to this trial. "You think you know what we are," she whispered to the uncaring sky, "but you have never seen anything like humanity before. And by the time you understand your mistake, it will be far too late." The first night on Vareth 9 claimed 12 lives, mostly elderly and sick individuals whose bodies could not withstand the cold. The survivors buried them at dawn, marking each grave with a pile of red stones. And then they got to work building a future that the observers had never imagined possible. Humanity had been given a death sentence, but humanity had never been very good at accepting death. The first month on Vareth 9 was a time of death and discovery, and the humans learned that survival would cost them dearly in blood and tears. 63 people died in those early weeks, taken by predators and poison and the simple cruelty of an alien world that cared nothing for their suffering. A woman named Sarah touched a beautiful purple flower and died screaming. As the toxin burned through her veins, a young man named David wandered too far from camp at night and was found the next morning torn apart by something with many legs and sharp teeth. 3 children drank from a stream that looked clear and clean but was filled with acid that destroyed their stomachs from within. Each death was a lesson written in human pain, and the survivors learned to read that terrible book with desperate attention. But what made the humans different from all the species that had come before was not their ability to learn many. Species could learn from their mistakes and adapt to new environments. What made humans special was something far more powerful. They could teach when. Dr. Kofi Mensah discovered that the native root tubers could be made safe to eat through a process of fire and fermentation. He did not keep this knowledge to himself. Instead, he gathered everyone who would listen and showed them exactly how to identify the tubers, how to dig them up without damaging them, and how to prepare them so the poison broke down into harmless compounds within a week. Every single survivor knew how to find and prepare this food source when engineer Mei Chun figured out that the crystalline stones scattered across the landscape could be shaped into tools sharper than any metal. She did not hoard this advantage for herself or her closest allies. She taught stone-shaping classes every afternoon, patiently showing hundreds of people how to strike the crystals at just the right angle to create cutting edges that could slice through the toughest hide. When a former farmer named Anya Petrov noticed that certain small insects always fled in the same direction about 10 minutes before predator attacks, she did not simply use this knowledge to keep herself safe. She told everyone about the warning signs, and soon the entire camp had learned to watch the insects and listen for the silence that meant danger was coming. The observers watched all of this with growing confusion. From their orbital station observer primary, Zethel had studied countless intelligent species over millions of cycles, and it had never seen anything quite like this behavior. Information dispersal rate exceeds all prior subjects by a factor of 7.3. Zethel recorded in its data stream, and the mechanism behind this anomaly remains unclear. The ancient being ran simulation after simulation, trying to understand why the humans shared knowledge so freely when every other species had hoarded survival information as a source of power. The Veluxi discovered fire on day 12, Zethel noted, but only the leader's family group learned to create it, and they used this advantage to dominate the others until internal conflict destroyed them all. The Thorani identified safe food sources on day 23, but the discoverers kept this secret to ensure their own survival at the expense of others. Yet these Terrans share everything, the observer marveled, and even their most valuable discoveries are given freely to strangers and rivals alike. What Zethal could not understand was that humans had evolved on a world where cooperation was not a weakness but a strength. Their ancestors had hunted mammoths in groups because no single human could bring down such massive prey alone. They had built cities and civilizations through the sharing of knowledge across generations. They had survived ice ages and plagues not by competing with each other, but by working together against common threats. This was written into their very nature, and no amount of hardship could erase it. By the end of the second month, the human camp had transformed into something that surprised even Commander Yellen Vasquez. They had dug wells that reached clean water deep below the acidic surface streams. They had built walls of hardite stone that kept the predators out during the dangerous nights. They had created a system of watchfires and warning drums that allowed them to communicate danger across great distances, and most importantly, they had begun to map Vareth 9 with a detail and precision that would have impressed any cartographer on Earth Scout teams went out every day, carefully documenting everything they found and bringing that information back to share with the whole community. They marked the locations of predator dens with red symbols. They noted the places where safe water could be found with blue symbols. They recorded the seasonal movements of prey animals and the growth cycles of edible plants. All of this knowledge was collected and organized and taught to everyone who wanted to learn. A council of teachers emerged, respected men and women whose job was to ensure that no valuable information was ever lost. They taught the children alongside the adults, making sure that the next generation would know everything that had been learned through so much sacrifice. We cannot afford to let anyone remain ignorant. Dr. Mensa explained to a young mother who wondered why her 6-year-old needed to learn about predator avoidance. Because one day, that child might be the only person who can save themselves or someone else. And they need to know what we know. This attitude spread through the entire community until it became an unspoken law. Everyone taught what they knew, and everyone learned what others had to offer. The strong helped the weak, and the knowledgeable helped the ignorant. Because humans understood instinctively that their survival depended on the survival of the group in the orbital station. Observer Primary Zethula updated its predictions with visible reluctance. Revised survival timeline, 90 days. The ancient being recorded. Though the confidence level of this prediction has decreased significantly due to anomalous subject behavior, Zethul's colleague, Observer Secondary Methful, expressed doubt about even this revised estimate. They are not merely surviving, Methful observed, but rather they appear to be building something that resembles a sustainable community. Impossible, Zethul replied with certainty it no longer truly felt. Because no species survives the trial through cooperation alone, and their technology level is far too primitive to overcome the challenges that lie ahead. But even as the observers debated, the humans continued their relentless adaptation to Vareth 9. They learned which seasons brought rain and which brought drought. They discovered that certain plants could be woven into rope, stronger than any vine. They found that the bones of predators made excellent tools once the meat had been stripped away. Each discovery was shared, each lesson was taught, and each death was mourned by the whole community rather than forgotten. Third month ended with the human population still above 9,000, a number that defied every mathematical model the observers had ever created. Something unprecedented was happening on Vareth 9. Something that challenged everything the ancient Cathvari thought they knew about intelligent life. Humanity was not just surviving, humanity was learning the land itself, memorizing its moods and seasons and dangers with the patience of a species that had spent millions of years mastering difficult environments, and when they finished learning, they would begin to change everything. 6 months after the observers had abandoned them on Vareth 9, the humans stopped merely surviving and began to build something permanent. The settlement they called New Dawn rose from the red plains like a declaration of war against extinction itself. It was not beautiful by any standard that mattered on Earth, with its rough walls of gray, hardite stone and its roofs of woven native fiber that rustled in the constant wind, but it was strong and it was functional, and most importantly, it was theirs. Commander Yellen Vasquez stood on the watchtower they had built at the center of the settlement and looked out at what her people had created. 300 structures now filled the valley, ranging from simple sleeping shelters to complex workshops where craftspeople shaped stone and bone into increasingly sophisticated tools. A irrigation system wound through the entire settlement, carrying water from the deep wells to fields where they were attempting to cultivate the native tubers, and grains. Children played in the streets, their laughter rising above the sounds of construction and work. These children had been born on Vareth 9, the first generation of true settlers, who would never know Earth except through the stories their parents told. Ellen felt tears prick her eyes as she watched them run and shout and live without fear. This was what survival looked like when humans refused to accept defeat. But the physical structures of New Dawn were not the most impressive thing the humans had built. Far more remarkable was the system of governance they had created from nothing but necessity and the memory of civilizations left behind. The Council of 12 met every evening in the great hall at the center of the settlement, and their debates were often loud and sometimes angry a former politician named James argued for strict rationing of resources to ensure everyone received equal shares. A hunter named Zara insisted that those who contributed more should receive more in return. Dr. Mensa advocated for prioritizing the sick and elderly, while Mei Chun demanded that more resources be devoted to infrastructure and tools. They disagreed about almost everything, and their arguments sometimes lasted long into the night. But somehow, despite all the conflict, decisions emerged. Resources were allocated according to a complex system that balanced need against contribution. Labor was divided based on skill and ability rather than arbitrary assignment. Laws were written and posted in the central square. Simple rules that everyone understood and most people obeyed. The sick were cared for by a rotating group of volunteers, and the dead were mourned with ceremonies that gave meaning to their sacrifice. None of this had been given to them by the observers. They had created it themselves, drawing on memories of how societies had functioned on Earth and adapting those models to the unique challenges of their new world, high above in the orbital station. Observer Primary Zethel struggled to understand what it was witnessing. They governed themselves. Zethel reported to the High Conclave, the ruling body of the Kethvari civilization. And without hierarchy imposed from outside, they have created hierarchy from within. And without laws given to them, they have written their own laws. The High Conclave received this report with skepticism, bordering on disbelief. Your observations must be flawed. The primary speaker of the conclave responded, because sapient species require external structure to maintain social order. And this has been documented across 12 million cycles of experimentation. I am reporting only what I see. Zethel replied with a note of defensiveness. And what I see defies every model we have ever created. Then your models, interrupted Observer Secondary Methval, who had been watching the humans with growing fascination, are incomplete. A shocked silence followed this statement, because no observer had ever suggested that Kethvari models might be wrong, but the evidence was undeniable. The humans of New Dawn were not merely surviving but thriving, and they had done it without any of the external support that the observers had always believed essential for civilized development back on the surface. The humans continued their work without any awareness of the debates they were causing among their captors. A school had been established where children learned reading and writing and mathematics, alongside practical skills like hunting and farming and toolmaking. A library of sorts had been created, with important knowledge carved into stone tablets that would last for generations. A hospital served the sick and injured, staffed by Dr. Mensa and the 36 people he had trained in basic medicine. A workshop produced tools and weapons that grew more sophisticated with each passing month. Mei Chun had discovered how to create a primitive forge using the volcanic vents that dotted the northern territories, and the first metal tools were beginning to emerge from her experiments. These were crude compared to what they had known on Earth. Simple knives and hammers made from the metallic ores they had found in the mountains, but they represented something far more important than mere utility. They represented progress, the forward momentum of a civilization that refused to remain static. We could have just survived, Yellen said to Dr. Mensa one evening as they watched the sunset from the watchtower. And that would have been enough to prove those creatures wrong about us. But survival is not enough for humans, Mensa replied with a tired smile. Because we always want more. We always want to grow and build and improve. And maybe that is our greatest strength, or maybe it is our greatest madness. Perhaps it is both, Yellen suggested. And Mensa laughed at the truth in her words. The 8th month brought a new development that surprised even the optimists. Among FEMA, second settlement was founded to the east, established by a group of hunters who had discovered a valley rich with game and fresh water. They called it New Hope. And within weeks, They had begun trading with New Dawn, exchanging meat and leather for tools and medicine. The road between the two settlements was rough and dangerous, but humans traveled it anyway, carrying goods and news and the knowledge that they were no longer alone in this hostile world. Other settlements followed as the months passed, each one connected to the others by trade routes and communication systems. By the end of the first year, 5 separate communities dotted the landscape of Varth 9, and all of them shared resources and knowledge as if they were one extended family. The observers had expected the humans to fracture under pressure, to split into warring tribes that would weaken each other until extinction claimed them all. Instead, they had done the opposite, spreading out to reduce risk while maintaining connections that made them stronger than any single community could be. Update survival timeline to indefinite. Observer Primary Zethal recorded with something that might have been admiration, because current trajectory suggests long-term sustainability if no major catastrophe intervenes. The ancient being paused before adding a note of concern. However, Zethal continued, Varth 9 is known for periodic catastrophic events, and the next Scarlet season is projected to begin in approximately 4 months. We shall see how their cooperation fares when the world itself turns against them. In New Dawn, the humans had no warning of what was coming. They continued to build and grow and dream of a future that seemed brighter with each passing day, but Varth 9 was not finished testing them, and the greatest challenge of all was already stirring in the depths of the planet, waiting to emerge and destroy everything they had worked so hard to create. The Scarlet season came without warning on a morning that had seemed like any other. The ground beneath New Dawn began to shake just after sunrise. A gentle trembling at first that grew into a violent convulsion within minutes. Buildings that had taken months to construct collapsed in seconds. Burying people beneath tons of hardite stone cracks opened in the earth, swallowing livestock and supplies, and sometimes entire families who had been standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Then the sky turned. Red volcanic vents that had been dormant since the humans arrived suddenly erupted across the northern territories, spewing ash and toxic gases into the atmosphere. The sun disappeared behind a curtain of gray and crimson, and day became a perpetual twilight that would last for weeks. Commander Yellen Vasquez, her hair now gray and her face weathered by 2 years of struggle, pulled herself from the rubble of her collapsed shelter and looked out at the devastation. Half of New Dawn lay in ruins, fires burned in a dozen places where cooking flames had spread to. Collapsed structures, people screamed and wept and called out for loved ones buried beneath the debris, and in the distance, she could see the orange glow of fresh lava flows creeping down from the mountains to the north. This is how it ends, she whispered to herself. And for one terrible moment, she believed it. But then she heard a voice cutting through the chaos, and she recognized it as belonging to her daughter Elena. Everyone who can move, get to the eastern gate. Elena was shouting, her voice carrying the same authority her mother had displayed on that first terrifying night. Help the injured if you can, but keep moving east away from the lava. Other voices joined hers as leaders throughout the settlement began organizing. The survivors Dr. Mensa emerged from the ruins of the hospital, his arm clearly broken, but his voice steady as he directed people to gather the wounded. May Chen was already leading a team toward the wells, checking to see if the water supply had survived the earthquake. The humans did not panic. They did not turn on each other or abandon the weak or surrender to despair. Instead, they did what humans had always done when faced with catastrophe. They worked together high above in the orbital station. The observers watched with detached curiosity. The Scarlet season has begun as predicted, Observer Primary Zethal recorded, and initial casualties appear significant but not immediately extinction level. This is the point where other species have broken, Observer Secondary Methval noted, and the Veluxi descended into cannibalism during a similar event. while the Thorani split into warring factions that destroyed each other. Let us observe how the Terrans respond to true catastrophe on the surface. The humans were responding in ways that defied every prediction. Instead of gathering into one fortified position and trying to wait out the disaster, they did something the observers had never seen. They dispersed. Elon had given the order after a quick consultation with her council. And the logic was brutally simple. If we stay together and something kills us, humanity dies, she explained to the gathered survivors. But if we spread out and something kills some of us, the rest will carry on. Within hours, the population of New Dawn had split into dozens of smaller groups, each one heading in a different direction toward areas that seemed safer from the volcanic activity. They carried with them copies of all the knowledge they had accumulated, carved into portable stone tablets or simply memorized by multiple people. Every group included at least one healer, one hunter, and one builder. No skill was allowed to exist in only one place, because the humans understood that redundancy was the key to survival. The weeks that followed were the hardest the humans had ever endured. Earthquakes continued to shake the land at unpredictable intervals. Ash covered everything, making it difficult to breathe and impossible to see the sun. Temperatures swung wildly between burning heat near the volcanic vents and freezing cold in the ash-covered lowlands. Food became scarce as the crops they had cultivated died beneath the gray blanket that covered the world. Yet still they persisted when one group discovered that the underground caves provided shelter from both the earthquakes and the toxic air. They sent runners to share this information with every other group they could find. When another group figured out how to filter the ash from water using layers of sand and charcoal, that knowledge spread across the scattered settlements within days. When a small band of survivors found a valley that had been protected from the worst of the volcanic activity by a ring of mountains, they sent out invitations for others to join them. The communication systems they had built during the peaceful months proved their worth now, as drum signals and fire beacons carried messages across distances that would have taken days to travel on foot. New hope still stands, one message reported, and we have room for refugees from the north. The eastern caves are safe, another announced, and we have found clean water and can provide shelter for hundreds. Medical supplies needed at the river crossing, a third requested, and anyone with healing knowledge, please come immediately. The Scarlet season lasted for 3 months, and during that time the humans lost nearly 2,000 people. Some died in the initial earthquakes, others in the lava flows that reshaped the northern territories, still others from starvation and disease and the simple exhaustion of fighting to survive in a world that seemed determined to kill them. But they did not break. Every death was recorded and remembered. Every mistake was analyzed so it would not be repeated. Every lesson learned was shared with everyone who might benefit, and through it all, they helped each other. When the southern settlements ran low on food, the eastern settlements sent what they could spare. When a disease swept through the cave communities, healers from other groups risked their lives to bring medicine and expertise. When a group of children was found wandering alone after their parents had been killed, other families took them in without hesitation. By the time the ash began to settle and the earthquakes subsided, something remarkable had happened. The human population had not just survived the Scarlet season, it had grown. New births had outnumbered deaths during those terrible months. And when the survivors emerged from their shelters and caves to assess what remained of their world, they numbered over 12,000. They had lost settlements and crops and countless treasures that could never be replaced, but they had gained something far more valuable: the absolute certainty that nothing Verith 9 could throw at them would be enough to break them. We learned the land's gentleness, Commander Yellen Vasquez said to her people as they gathered for the first time since the disaster began. And now we have learned its fury. Her daughter Elena stood beside her, ready to take on more responsibility as her mother's strength began to fade. The Scarlet season will come again, Elena added. And when it does, we will be ready, because we have made its lessons part of who we are. In the orbital station, Observer Primary Zethel stared at the data with something approaching disbelief. They should have died, the ancient being murmured. And every model we have predicts extinction under these conditions. Perhaps, Methval suggested quietly. We need new models. Zethel did not respond. But the thought lingered in the observers' ancient minds. Something unprecedented was happening on Vareth 9. And for the first time in 12 million cycles, the Kethvari had no idea how the story would end. 5 years after the seeding, the Kethvari observers descended from their orbital station for the first time since the experiment began. They came in vessels of light that shimmered with technologies beyond human understanding, landing in the central square of New Dawn with the casual arrogance of beings who had watched civilizations rise and fall for 12 million cycles. Observer Primary Zethal emerged from the lead vessel and stopped in genuine surprise. And what it found, the humans had not merely survived, they had built a civilization. 5 settlements now dotted the landscape of Vareth 9, connected by roads that had been carved through solid rock with tools. The humans had invented themselves farms stretched across the valleys, growing crops that had been bred to thrive in the harsh alien soil. Windmills turned on the hills, capturing energy from the constant winds to power forges and workshops. Children ran through the streets without fear, speaking a language that had already begun to evolve from the earth tongues their parents had brought with them. Art decorated the walls of public buildings, paintings and carvings that told the story of humanity's struggle and triumph on this hostile world. Music drifted from a gathering hall where people had assembled to celebrate a wedding. The sound of drums and flutes and voices raised in joy, and at the center of it all stood the council hall, a massive structure of polished stone where the elected leaders of humanity met to govern their growing gnashing. Zethal had expected to find desperate survivors clinging to existence instead. The observer found something that the Kethvari had never seen in 12 million cycles of experimentation. A species that had transformed adversity into strength. The council was summoned to receive the observers, and Elena Vasquez took her place at the head of the table. Her mother Yellen had passed away 2 years earlier, finally succumbing to age and the accumulated wear of decades of struggle. But Yellen's legacy lived on in her daughter, who had inherited both her mother's iron will and her talent for leadership. Elena was joined by 11 other council members, representatives from each of the 5 settlements and from the various guilds and professions that made human society function. Dr. Kofi Mensa sat at her right hand. Now ancient and frail but still sharp-minded Mai Chun occupied the seat to her left, her engineering genius still producing innovations that continued to transform human life on Vareth 9. Together they faced the observers across the stone table and waited for the ancient beings to explain why they had finally chosen to show themselves. And spoke the ritual words that had been spoken to countless species before, the formal acknowledgement of survival that marked the end of every trial. You were commanded to survive without aid, the observer intoned, its voice resonating in every human mind. And you have survived beyond all expectation and prediction. The Kethvari Conclave hereby recognizes your species as worthy of continued existence among the stars. A murmur ran through the assembled humans, though whether it expressed relief or anger or something else entirely was difficult to determine. We offer now what we denied before, Zethal continued, and our gifts include technology that will ease your struggles, resources that will end your material wants, and passage to worlds more suited to your biological requirements if you desire. The observer paused and spread its limbs in a gesture that might have indicated generosity. Name your desire, and the HFY will provide. A long silence followed as Elena considered her response. Behind her stood humans who had been broken by this world and had rebuilt themselves stronger. Humans who had buried friends and family in alien soil and kept living. Despite their grief, humans who had learned every cruel lesson Vareth 9 had to teach and had transformed suffering into wisdom. These were not the same people who had awakened in red dust 5 years ago, confused and frightened and utterly dependent on the mercy of beings who had shown them none. These were survivors in the truest sense of the word, and they had earned the right to speak for themselves. We desire nothing from you, Elena said, and her voice carried the weight of humanity's entire journey. The observers shifted in visible surprise, their ancient minds struggling to process a response they had never encountered before. You misunderstand, Zethel said after a moment, because we offer you paradise. We offer you ease and comfort, and freedom from the struggles that have defined your existence on this harsh world. We understand perfectly, Elena replied, and our answer remains the same. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the settlement her mother had helped build from nothing. You commanded us to survive, she said, but we chose to live, and there is a difference that you do not seem to understand. She turned back to face the observers, and her eyes held no fear. Vareth 9 is our home now, Elena declared, and we learned its language through years of suffering and sacrifice. And we earned our place here through blood and tears and the deaths of thousands of our people. You did not give us this world, she continued, her voice rising, and you cannot take it away by offering us something easier. We will stay, and we will thrive, and we will build something here that will last for generations. The other council members rose to stand beside her, presenting a united front to the ancient beings who had once seemed so powerful. You thought you were testing us, Dr. Mensa added, his old voice steady despite his frailty. But you were actually teaching us who we really are, and who you are, Mei-Chun finished, is beings who underestimate humanity at your own peril. The observers departed in silence, their vessels rising into the sky and vanishing into the darkness. Between stars, they had come expecting gratitude and submission, the natural response of a species that had been saved from extinction. Instead, they had found defiance and pride and a determination that their ancient models had no way of predicting in the final entry of their Vareth 9 data stream. Observer Primary Zethal recorded a single annotation that would trouble the High Conclave for centuries to come. Recommendation, Zethal wrote. Do not test humanity again. They do not fail gracefully, and they do not accept defeat. Given sufficient adversity, they do not merely survive, but rather transform adversity itself into strength. This species is not an experiment. They are a variable we cannot control. Back on Vareth 9, the humans celebrated their independence with the biggest festival in their short history. Music played through the night as people danced and sang and told stories of the journey that had brought them here. Children who had never known Earth listened with wonder to tales of blue skies and green forests and oceans that stretched beyond imagination. And Elena Vasquez stood on the same watchtower where her mother had once kept watch, looking up at the alien stars with a smile on her face. We did it, she whispered to the memory of Yellen Vasquez. And you were right all along. They had no idea what humanity was capable of, far above. The observers carried their report back to the High Conclave, a report that would force the ancient HFY to reconsider everything they thought they knew about intelligent life. And on the surface of Vareth 9, humanity continued to do what it had always done best. They built. They grew, they learned, and they dreamed of a future that stretched out before them like an endless road waiting to be traveled. Observers had commanded them to survive. Without aid, humanity had responded by building a civilization that needed no one's permission to exist, and that made all the difference.